It's funny how you can look at a place your whole life, see it on postcards and TV specials, and think you understand it. For me, that place was the Winchester Mystery House. I grew up in the South Bay, maybe a 20-minute drive from its gates on a good day. To us kids, it was just a weird, sprawling tourist trap, a place you went on a fourth-grade field trip to giggle at the stairways that went nowhere and the doors that opened onto walls. It was a local curiosity, a historical oddity. It was never, ever something to be afraid of. I want to be very clear about that. Before the summer of 2018, the Winchester Mystery House was about as scary to me as a corn maze in broad daylight. This all started because I was good at my job. I run a small, specialized IT company, just me and a couple of guys I contract with, and we specialize in structured cabling for difficult buildings. Historic sites, places with thick walls, weird layouts, that was our niche. We just finished a big, successful project retrofitting an old theater in San Francisco, and our name got passed along. Next thing I know, I'm getting a call from the operations manager of the Winchester Mystery House itself. His name was Dave, a perfectly normal, middle-aged guy with a receding hairline and a permanent look of being 5 minutes behind schedule. He told me they were looking to do a complete overhaul of their network infrastructure. New security cameras, robust Wi-Fi for the guests and staff, the whole 9 yards. It was a massive, complicated job, and they needed someone who could do it without damaging the historical integrity of the building. The pay was fantastic, more than enough to set my little company up for the next year. How could I say no? It was a challenge, a great paycheck, and honestly, a pretty cool story to tell. Yeah, I'm the guy who wired the Winchester Mystery House. It sounded impressive. I met Dave on a bright, sunny Monday in late July. The kind of California day where the sky is a perfect, cloudless blue and the air is warm and smells like dry grass and car exhaust. The house looked exactly like it always did from the outside, a chaotic jumble of Victorian turrets, gables, and porches, all painted in that familiar pale yellow and rust red. It was big, sure, but it felt tame. Manicured lawns, a bustling gift shop, families with strollers milling about. It felt like Disneyland's weird cousin. Dave gave me the grand tour, but not the one the tourists get. We used service corridors, back stairs, and dusty, forgotten hallways. He had a set of master keys on a big, heavy ring that jangled with a kind of weary authority. The main challenge, he said, his voice echoing slightly in a long, narrow passage, is the sheer unpredictability. There are no reliable blueprints. None. Sarah Winchester fired architects as fast as she hired them. Most of this was built from sketches she supposedly drew on napkins during seances. He chuckled, a short, humorless sound. So, you're basically flying blind. We need you to run cable through whatever you can run it through without a tourist seeing it. For the first week, that's exactly what I did. I spent 10 hours a day tracing the guts of that house. I was a rat in its walls. And I've got to tell you, the place is even weirder from the inside. You see things the tours don't show you. Tiny, crawlspace-sized doors that open into the middle of a 4-story vertical shaft. A window on an interior wall that looks into another, smaller room, which itself has a window looking into another. It was a building designed by a fever dream. But it was still just a building. An old, creaky, strangely designed building. I'm a practical guy. I believe in physics. Old houses settle. Wood expands in contracts. Drafts make noises. For every weird thing, I had a rational, simple explanation. I was a man of science in a house of superstition. The first red flag, as they say, was so small I almost didn't even register it. It was about day 3. I was in what they call the Hall of Fires, a long corridor lined with multiple fireplaces. I was on a stepladder, feeding a network cable through a small hole I drilled in the ceiling molding. It was quiet, except for the distant, muffled chatter of a tour group somewhere on the floor below. I had my tools laid out on a canvas drop cloth on the floor. A wire stripper, a spool of CAT6 cable, a drill, a small bag of zip ties. I knew exactly where everything was. I needed the wire stripper. I glanced down. It wasn't there. I frowned, looking around on the cloth. Not there. I got down off the ladder. I looked under the cloth. I checked my tool belt. Even though I knew I hadn't put it back. Nothing. I let out an annoyed sigh, figuring it must have rolled away. I got on my hands and knees, peering into the dusty shadows under a nearby settee. And that's when I saw it. It was sitting perfectly upright on the mantel of the fireplace furthest down the hall. At least 20 feet away from my work area. I just stared at it for a solid 10 seconds. There was no one else in the hall. The tour group was long gone. I hadn't been down to that end of the hall all day. My brain did what brains do. It grasped for the simplest answer. You must have put it there earlier and forgot. It was a weak explanation. I'm meticulous with my tools. It's part of the job. But it was an explanation. And that was enough. I walked down, picked it up, and went back to work, feeling a little foolish. But for the first time, the silence in that hallway felt heavy. It felt like it was listening. A couple of days later, the real work began, the night shifts. Dave explained that for the main tour routes, like the Grand Ballroom and the Séance Room, all work had to be done after hours to avoid disrupting the flow of tourists. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., the place was all mine. The first night was just eerie. I've worked plenty of lonely night jobs. But this was different. Every building has its own sound when it's empty. At night, the Winchester House hums. It's a low, almost sub-audible vibration you feel in your teeth. The old wood groans and creaks. The pipes tick and moan. I kept telling myself it was normal. It was a 100-year-old wooden mansion. Of course it made noise. I set up a temporary base of operations in a small, unused office off the main courtyard. I had my laptop, schematics, a big thermos of coffee, and a radio playing softly to cut the silence. My first task was the Grand Ballroom. It's a beautiful, unsettling room, an ornate fireplace, a pipe organ, and windows that were once on an exterior wall but now look into other parts of the house. Around 2 a.m., I was up on a scaffold, running a cable along a high ceiling beam. Everything was dead quiet, save for the low hiss of my radio. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of a hammer hitting a nail. Faint, but clear. And it was coming from somewhere deep inside the house. I stopped what I was doing, straining to listen. Tap, 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 tap. It sounded like someone was building something. The sound had a rhythm to it. Steady, methodical. I got on my radio and called the lone security guard on duty. A guy named Manny who mostly sat in his booth at the main entrance. Hey Manny, you copy? His voice crackled back, thick with sleep. Yeah, Alex. What's up? You guys got any other maintenance crews working tonight? I'm hearing hammering. There was a pause. Negative. Man, it's just you and me. The whole estate is locked down. Probably just the pipes. This place makes noises. Yeah, I said, but the sound wasn't like any pipe I'd ever heard. Yeah, okay, must be it. I tried to go back to work, but the sound persisted for another hour. A distant, phantom construction crew in the heart of the sleeping house. My mind kept going back to the legend. Construction. 24 hours a day. 7 days a week. For 38 years. I shook my head. A cold knot tightening in my gut. Get a grip. It's an echo from a nearby street. It's your mind playing tricks on you. But the seed of doubt had been planted. And in the fertile ground of that house's silence, it was starting to grow. The next night, I was tasked with installing a camera and a wireless access point in the Séance Room. If there's a heart to the madness of that house, it's this room. It's not grand. It's small, claustrophobic, and windowless. They tell you on the tour that it has 3 doors. One you enter through. One is a normal exit. But the third one is a drop. It's maybe a foot high off the floor. And when you open it, you're looking straight down into the kitchen sink on the floor below. A drop of about 8 feet. A perfect, bizarre little death trap. I hated that room. The air in it was thick, still, and cold, colder than anywhere else in the house. It felt like all the sound was being sucked out of the space. And all I could hear was the blood rushing in my own ears. I worked as fast as I could, my hands fumbling, my skin covered in goosebumps despite the warm night outside. I had just mounted the camera and was connecting the wires when I felt it. A sudden, sharp drop in temperature. It was like someone had opened a freezer door right behind me. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up. I could see my breath fog in the air. I spun around. Nothing. Just the empty room. The 3 closed doors. Then I heard the whisper. It was so faint. I thought it was the air hissing from the vents. But there were no vents in that room. It was a soft, sibilant sound, like the rustle of a silk dress. And it came from the corner where the tiny drop door was. It wasn't a word, just a sound. Shish. I was frozen solid. My heart was hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. I've never been a believer in ghosts. I've always been the guy who laughs at horror movies. But in that moment, in that cold, silent room, I was not a skeptic. I was prey. Slowly, deliberately, I gathered my tools. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my pliers. I didn't run. I walked. I walked out the normal exit door, closed it gently behind me, and didn't stop walking until I was back in my little office. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, my radio playing a cheerful pop song that sounded alien and grotesque. I sat there for an hour, drinking cold coffee, trying to get my heart rate back to normal. I almost packed up and left right then. I should have. God, I should have left. But there was the contract, the money, my professional reputation. I told myself I was overtired. I was letting the house's reputation get to me. I was psyching myself out. I had a job to finish. The next few nights were a blur of tense, caffeine-fueled work. I avoided the séance room like the plague. But the house wasn't done with me. The small things started to escalate. A door at the end of a long hallway would be open when I knew I had just walked past it and it was closed. I'd catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow that vanished when I turned my head. Once, working on the 3rd floor, I smelled it, a strong, cloying scent of flowers, like old, decaying perfume. It filled the hallway for a minute, and then it was gone. The real turning point came when I finally got the first phase of the security camera system online. I had about 20 cameras feeding back to my laptop in the office. It was incredible, really. I could see all these empty, silent parts of the house at once. The grand ballroom, the hall of fires, the long, winding corridors of the 2nd floor. It was about 3:30 a.m. I was sitting there, monitoring the feeds, making sure everything was stable. And then I saw it. On camera 17, which was pointed down a long, narrow hallway on the 2nd floor, famous for its switchback staircases. At the far end of the hall was a simple, white wooden door. As I watched, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, with purpose, I leaned closer to the screen, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't the house settling. A hand was turning that knob. But there was no hand. The knob turned a full quarter turn. The latch clicked, and the door swung silently inward, revealing a dark, empty room beyond. I stared, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I scanned the other camera feeds. Nothing. Every other hallway was still and empty. I looked back at camera 17. The door stood open. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. It just stood there, a dark, gaping mouth in the middle of my screen. I was about to radio Manny. To tell him, what? That a door opened by itself? He'd think I was crazy. Then, just as I was reaching for the radio, the door slammed shut. It wasn't a gentle swing. It slammed with such force that I could hear the faint boom of it through the floors of the house. Even from my office, the camera vibrated from the impact. I hit rewind on the footage. I watched it again. The knob turning, the door opening, the 5 minutes of stillness, the violent slam. I watched it 5 times. 10 times. It was real. It was on video. Undeniable, inexplicable, and utterly terrifying. My skepticism didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. The house wasn't just a collection of wood and nails. It was something else. It was awake. It was aware. And it knew I was there. The feeling of being watched was no longer a feeling. It was a fact. The cameras proved it. The fear after that was different. It wasn't the jumpy, on-edge feeling from before. It was a cold, heavy dread that settled deep in my bones. A constant, grinding certainty that I was not alone. I started talking to myself. Humming. Anything to fill the oppressive silence. I found myself checking the camera feeds obsessively. Like a man watching his own prison. Sometimes, I'd see things. A flicker of movement on a staircase. A light in a distant room that would turn on, then off again, in a part of the house where the wiring was a century old and disconnected. I never saw a person. Just the house, moving around me. The final night came. I had one job left. One last access point to install. It was in one of the most remote and notoriously strange parts of the house. A third-floor corridor near the famous, $25, storage closet and, more importantly, near the door to nowhere. This door is one of the house's most unsettling features. It's a normal-looking interior door. But when you open it, there's no room. There's no floor. There's just a 3-story drop to the garden below. Sarah supposedly had it installed to confuse spirits, to have them step through and be cast out of the house. As I headed up there, a storm was rolling in. The wind was howling outside, rattling the hundreds of windows in the house, making the whole structure groan like a ship at sea. It was the perfect pathetic fallacy. A cliché I would have laughed at a week ago. I wasn't laughing now. The third floor was a nightmare maze. Halls that were barely wider than my shoulders. Tiny staircases that went up 2 steps and then down 3. The air was thin and dusty. I found the spot where the final installation had to go. It was a small alcove, right next to the door to nowhere. I set down my gear. The wind was shrieking. A branch scraped against a nearby window, making me jump so hard I nearly dropped my drill. My heart was a frantic drum. Just finish this. Get it done and get out. Never come back. I was working, my back to the hallway, facing the wall of the alcove. The only light was from my headlamp. All I could hear was the storm and my own ragged breathing. Then, a new sound cut through the noise. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. Scrape, drag. It came from the hallway behind me. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the old wooden floorboards. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My headlamp beam was fixed on the wall in front of me. I didn't want to turn around. I was paralyzed by that specific, primal terror that roots you to the spot. Scrape, drag. It was closer now. It was slow, methodical. I could hear the splintering of the old wood. I thought about the legend of Sarah Winchester, crippled by arthritis in her later years, dragging herself through these same halls. My mind was screaming, run, turn around and run. But I couldn't move. The dragging stopped. Silence. A profound, absolute silence that was somehow louder than the storm outside. The wind seemed to die down at that exact moment. All I could hear was the frantic pounding in my chest. And then I heard the doorknob. Not the door to nowhere in front of me. The knob on the door at the far end of the hall I had just come through. My only way out. Jiggle, rattle, rattle, jiggle. It was a frantic, insistent sound, like someone was on the other side, trying to get in, but the door was stuck. My blood ran cold. I was trapped on the 3rd floor of this labyrinth, between a door that opened onto thin air and another door that something was trying to open. The rattling stopped. More silence, an eternity of it, packed into a few seconds. Slowly, fighting every instinct, I forced myself to turn around. My headlamp beam cut a clean, white circle through the oppressive darkness of the corridor. I pointed it down the long, narrow hall. At the far end, standing in front of the door, was a figure. It was just a silhouette. The light from my headlamp seemed to be absorbed by it, not reflected. I couldn't make out a face, or clothes, or anything. Just a tall, slender shape that was unnaturally still. The shape of a woman in a long, old-fashioned dress. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, in the darkness, at the end of the hall, watching me. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in this silent standoff. It could have been 10 seconds or 10 minutes. Time had ceased to exist. There was only the howling wind, the dark shape, and a fear so pure and so absolute that it felt like it was dissolving me from the inside out. The figure raised an arm, slowly, and it pointed, not at me, it pointed at the door to nowhere, right beside me. That broke the spell. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was pure, animal instinct. A circuit breaker in my brain flipped, and the only command was escape. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe. I dropped my tools, my expensive drill, my meters, everything, and they clattered onto the floor with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud. I turned and ran. I ran away from the shape, Away from the pointing finger. Down a different, unexplored corridor, plunging deeper into the maze. I had no idea where I was going. I was just running, up tiny staircases, down cramped hallways, my shoulder bumping against the walls. The house felt like it was changing around me. The walls closing in. I could hear noises behind me now, a frantic shuffling. The whisper of a dress on the floorboards. I didn't dare look back. I burst through a door and found myself on one of the low-sloped staircases. I scrambled down it, my boots slipping, and took a turn at random. And then another. It was a blind, panicked flight through a geometric hell. Finally, I saw a familiar sight, the stained glass windows of the grand ballroom. I knew the way out from there. I half fell, half ran through the ballroom, past the cold fireplace, through the main foyer, and fumbled with the lock on one of the main doors. It opened, and I stumbled out into the night. The storm had broken. Cool rain was lashing down, soaking me in seconds. I didn't care. I gasped in the wet, clean air, my lungs burning. I ran across the courtyard, not even looking back at the sprawling, dark silhouette of the house. I got to my truck, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside, locking it immediately. I just sat there for a moment, shaking uncontrollably, rain and sweat plastering my hair to my forehead. I stared at the house. Its hundreds of windows looked like 1,000 dead eyes, all staring back at me. I didn't go back for my tools. I didn't go back to the office to get my laptop or my thermos. I started the truck and I drove. I drove out of the parking lot, and I didn't stop until I was on the freeway. The lights of San Jose shrinking in my rearview mirror. The next morning, I called Dave. I told him there was a family emergency. A damn lie. I told him I couldn't finish the job, but that 99% of it was done. I'd email instructions for the last part. He was annoyed, but I didn't care. I told him to mail me a check for the work I'd completed and to keep the rest. I forfeited thousands of dollars. It was the easiest decision I've ever made. He called me back a day later. He said they found my tools on the 3rd floor. He asked if I was okay. I just said I was fine and hung up. I never spoke to him again. To this day, I can't give you a neat explanation for what happened. I've tried. I've told myself it was a waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and the power of suggestion. I've told myself the figure was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree branch in the storm. But I know what I saw. I know the feeling of that unnatural cold. I know the sound of that doorknob turning on the video feed. And I know the absolute, soul-crushing terror of seeing that dark shape at the end of the hall. It's been 7 years. I live on the other side of the country now. I don't work in old buildings anymore. I can't. Sometimes, on quiet nights, if I let my mind wander, I can still hear the distant sound of a hammer. Tap, tap, tap. Sometimes I'll catch a faint scent of old flowers and my heart will seize up. Sarah Winchester spent 38 years building a prison for her ghosts. A maze to contain her fear. I don't know if she succeeded, but I know that for a few terrifying nights, I was locked in there with them. And a small part of me, the part that wakes me up in a cold sweat at 3 a.m., is afraid that when I ran out of that house, I didn't run out alone.